I am Geneviève, 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago, my parents and brother laughed in my face at a high society gala, joking that I could barely afford rent on my modest salary. Picture this: the Savannah Historical Society Spring Gala, live oaks draped in Spanish moss, waiters in crisp white jackets, the air thick with jasmine and old money. My mother stood among the local elite, sipping champagne, pointing at me like a charity case. "This is my daughter Geneviève," she told them, her voice carrying over the string quartet. "She has a sweet little desk job up in Atlanta. We worry about her rent. We might need to give her an allowance so she does not live in a shoebox." The crowd chuckled. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I just took a sip of my sparkling water and smiled. Because what my mother did not know was that I had just bought the historic Savannah estate she was standing in right out from under her. When the new deed arrived and I told them market rent was due in 30 days, my mother burst into tears. What happened next? That is what I am here to tell you today. Before I continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Morning Revenge, but only if you genuinely want to know how this story ends. And let me know in the comments what your age is and where you are watching from. Now, let me take you back to how this all started at that very same gala, the Frank family of Savannah, Georgia. That is how we were known. We were supposed to be the picture of Southern aristocracy. My parents lived in a sprawling antebellum home that had been in Richard and Caroline Frank's possession for decades. Growing up, our lives were dictated by a strict social hierarchy. You wore the right clothes, attended the right parties, and most importantly, you maintained the illusion of effortless wealth. I hated every second of it. I moved to Atlanta the moment I finished my degree, choosing a quiet career in finance over marrying into a local shipping dynasty. I became a senior foreclosure acquisitions director. My parents viewed my career as a polite hobby. To them, working a corporate job meant you lacked the generational prestige to simply exist. The evening of the spring gala was suffocating. The humidity clung to my skin, and the scent of gardenias mixed with expensive perfume made the air feel heavy. I stood near the edge of the brick patio, keeping my distance from the center of attention. My mother, Caroline, held court under the largest oak tree. She wore a custom emerald gown that caught the patio lighting. Her posture was rigid, her smile practiced. Every time she glanced my way, her eyes flicked down to my shoes. They were good shoes, sensible leather pumps, but they lacked the red soles she deemed mandatory for public appearances. I stepped closer to the circle, just in time to hear her delivering her favorite routine. She swirled her champagne, letting the crystal catch the light. "Geneviève is finding her way," she sighed, adopting a tone of rehearsed maternal concern. "Atlanta is so chaotic. She works at a firm doing paperwork. We just pray she meets someone established soon." A woman next to her, dripping in pearls, gave me a pitying look. I kept my face blank. Letting them see frustration only gave them fuel. My older brother Preston slid into the group. He smelled of bourbon and expensive cigars. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored linen suit, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Do not worry about Jen," he said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "She is building character. Living on a budget builds grit." Speaking of building, I just finalized the specs on the new Porsche. Custom interior. It takes 6 months to import, but quality takes time. The group murmured in appreciation. Preston thrived on this energy. He was the golden child, the one who stayed in Savannah, the one who supposedly carried the Frank legacy. I looked at the slight tremor in his hand as he held his glass. I noticed the way his smile did not quite reach his eyes. I did not say a word about the budget comment. I knew arguing would only escalate his performance. My phone vibrated against my palm. The pattern was a custom high-priority alert from my firm. I work with distressed assets, handling portfolios worth hundreds of millions. A notification like this meant a Tier 1 foreclosure package had just bypassed standard municipal filing and was flagged for immediate liquidation. It was the kind of debt bundle that required instant analysis. I stepped back, letting Preston recount his upholstery choices to the captivated audience. I slipped away from the laughter and the humidity, finding a quiet alcove in the dim corridor of the clubhouse. The heavy wooden doors shut behind me, muting the string quartet. The air conditioning chilled the sweat on the back of my neck. I unlocked my screen. The encrypted file loaded. The summary data showed a bank offloading a non-performing high-value residential debt package due to sustained default. This was not a standard missed payment situation. This was years of borrowing multiple liens and a complete financial collapse. The bank was skipping the usual grace periods to sell the note directly to a commercial developer. I tapped the screen to view the primary asset. The address loaded in stark black text against the white background. I stopped breathing. I read the street name. I read the parcel number. I traced the digits of the zip code. My thumb hovered over the screen as the names of the primary debtors materialized. Richard and Caroline Frank. I read it again. The numbers stared back at me, cold and unyielding. The total debt was staggering. They were $2.5 million in the red. They had taken out secondary and tertiary mortgages. They had borrowed against the equity to fund luxury cars, country club dues, and lavish parties like the one happening just on the other side of the door. The historic Savannah estate, the crown jewel of their precious social standing, was scheduled for public auction in exactly 14 days. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the faint sound of my mother laughing on the patio. She was out there, mocking my salary, while standing in a dress she bought with money that did not exist. The Porsche Preston was bragging about was funded by a house of cards that was currently collapsing under their feet. The bank was planning to sell the property to a developer who wanted to bulldoze the historic house and build a strip mall. If the note sold, the Frank legacy would be turned into a paved parking lot by the end of the month. A cold clarity washed over me. My hands stopped shaking. I did not feel pity. I felt the sharp, undeniable truth of numbers. Numbers do not care about old money or Spanish moss. Numbers demand to be balanced. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. I did not march out to the patio to confront them. I walked straight out the front doors of the clubhouse, handed my ticket to the valet, and drove back to Atlanta in the dark. They wanted to pretend they owned the world. I was going to let them, right up until the moment I bought it from them. The drive back to Atlanta took 4 hours. I did not turn on the radio. I let the hum of the tires on the asphalt fill the silence of the cabin. By the time Monday morning arrived, the heavy coastal humidity of Savannah was a distant memory, replaced by the crisp, sterile air of my midtown office. My workspace sat on the 30th floor of a steel and glass tower. Wall-to-wall windows offered a sweeping view of the skyline. Dual monitors glowed on my desk. The faint, steady hum of high-speed servers filtered through the walls. This was my domain. There were no magnolias here, no social hierarchies based on whose great-grandfather owned which cotton fields. Here, the only thing that mattered was the math, and the math never lied. I set my coffee cup on the glass desk and booted up the terminal. My hands hovered over the keyboard. For a fleeting second, the image of my mother in her emerald gown flashed in my mind, her voice dripping with pity as she described my desk job to her friends. I pushed the memory aside and pressed enter. The secure database accessed the encrypted foreclosure file. I spent the next 4 hours performing a rigorous financial autopsy on my own family. Growing up, Richard and Caroline Frank operated under a very specific delusion. They believed wealth was a permanent, static trait tied to their bloodline, rather than a mathematical equation that required balancing. I remembered being 12 years old, watching my mother hire a string quartet for a lavish garden party, while simultaneously hiding the water bill in a silver tureen. The facade was always the priority. Reality was just an inconvenience they felt entitled to ignore. Now, reality was bleeding across my dual monitors in bright red font. I traced the paper trail backward. It was worse than a simple missed payment or a temporary cash flow issue. It was a structural collapse. The primary mortgage had been refinanced 3 times in the last decade. My father had drained the equity to sustain their lifestyle, treating the historic house like an endless bank account. But the initial refinancing was just the beginning. I clicked into the secondary liens. There was a revolving credit line maxed out at $400,000. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates. They aligned perfectly with my mother's month-long excursions to Europe and the recent custom renovations to the grand parlor. Then I found the tertiary mortgage, a high-risk variable rate loan secured through a private, less reputable lender. This was the ultimate desperation move. The funds distributed from this loan matched the exact purchase price of my father's vintage boat collection and the extravagant upfront catering costs for the spring gala. The total deficit sat at the bottom of the screen, $2.5 million in the red. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. My chest felt tight, but my mind was remarkably clear. They were drowning. They had been drowning for years. The sheer arrogance it took to stand at a country club and publicly mock my financial stability while standing on a trapdoor of debt was breathtaking. They had traded their legacy for the illusion of superiority. My desk phone buzzed, vibrating against the glass surface. I glanced at the caller ID, Preston. I took a slow breath, letting the tension seep out of my shoulders, and picked up the receiver. Geneviève, his voice boomed through the speaker. He sounded out of breath, the faint sound of seagulls and snapping canvas echoing in the background. He was at the marina. "Hello, Preston. Just checking in on my little sister," he said, his tone dripping with unearned authority. "You ducked out of the gala pretty early on Saturday. Mom thought you might have been intimidated by the crowd. You know how those events get. High rollers, big conversations." "I was tired," I said, my voice flat. My eyes tracked across his personal financial subfolder on my right monitor. I clicked open his recent bank statements, which had been pulled into the collective debt analysis due to his status as a dependent co-signer on one of the smaller credit lines. "Well, you missed a great night," Preston continued. "I actually just came down to the docks. I am looking at a new center console boat, twin engines, custom teak decking. It is a beauty. The broker is practically begging me to take it off his hands." I watched a red alert flash on my screen. A scheduled payment for Preston's country club dues had bounced just 72 hours ago. Insufficient funds. "A boat," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly level. "That sounds expensive." "Quality takes capital," Jen, he chuckled, the sound thick with condescension. "You have to spend money to make money. It is an investment in the brand. Listen, I know things are probably tight for you up in the city. Rent, groceries, all that mundane stuff. Next time you come down to Savannah, let me take you out to a nice steakhouse. My treat. You sound like you could use a good meal." I traced the mouse over a second bounce check. This one was for his luxury car lease. He was floating checks, playing a dangerous game of delay projecting wealth while his accounts bled dry. "That is very generous of you, Preston," I said. "Family takes care of family," he replied smoothly. "Just keep grinding at that desk job. You will find your footing eventually. I have to go. The broker is pulling around the golf cart." He hung up. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. Family takes care of family. The words echoed in the quiet office. He was attempting to buy a boat while his car was flagged for repossession. The delusion was terminal. I turned my attention back to the primary file. The bank handling the foreclosure was not a local institution. It was a national conglomerate that did not care about the Frank name or the historical significance of the antebellum architecture. They only cared about liquidating the bad debt. I opened the correspondence log between the bank and my parents. The bank had sent dozens of warnings, certified letters, final notices. My parents had ignored all of them, likely tossing the envelopes into the trash unopened, truly believing their social standing made them immune to collections. But the bank had reached its limit. I read the internal servicing notes. The standard grace period had expired months ago. The bank was bypassing the usual public auction route, deeming the property too much of a liability to leave vacant. They had already entered quiet negotiations with a commercial developer named Apex Holdings. I pulled up the corporate profile for Apex Holdings. They specialized in urban redevelopment. They bought distressed historical properties, secured demolition permits through municipal loopholes, and paved them over. I opened the attachment containing the developer's preliminary proposal. There were blueprints. My eyes scanned the harsh blue lines. Where the grand oak trees currently stood, they had drawn a sprawling concrete parking lot. Where the historic wraparound porch sat, they had outlined a commercial strip mall featuring a discount pharmacy and a chain coffee shop. The bank was skipping standard procedure to recoup their losses immediately. They had drafted a direct sale agreement with Apex. The bank executives were scheduled to sign the final transfer documents on Friday. I checked the calendar on the wall. Today was Monday. The air in the office suddenly felt thin. I stared at the blueprints. For all my resentment toward Richard and Caroline, for all their toxic snobbery and relentless cruelty, that house held generations of history. It was the only tangible thing our ancestors had built. The original pine floors, the sprawling gardens where I used to hide from their judgment, the crown molding, and my parents were going to lose it to a bulldozer because they preferred buying custom emerald gowns and twin-engine boats over paying their mortgage. I pulled up the exact timeline of the pending transaction. The electronic signature portal was set to lock at exactly 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. If the note transferred to Apex, the demolition permits would be fast-tracked. The house would be gone before the end of the month. My parents did not know. They were entirely oblivious, sipping sweet tea on a porch that was legally slated for destruction. I had 4 days to intercept the sale, maneuver my own corporate entity into the bidding position, and purchase the debt outright. If I failed, the Frank legacy would be turned into a strip mall by Friday evening. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my private legal counsel. It was time to buy a house. I did not decide to buy the Savannah estate out of a sudden surge of familial loyalty. Loyalty is a reciprocal concept, and the Franks had never offered me any. I acted out of a desire for absolute control. The thought of Apex Holdings tearing down the oak trees and replacing original heart pine floors with cheap commercial linoleum offended my sense of order. If anyone was going to strip the Frank family of their beloved ancestral home, it was going to be me. I picked up my phone and called David, my private corporate attorney. I gave him a single, uncompromising directive: intercept the commercial sale and prepare an airtight counteroffer on behalf of my private entity, Peach State Holdings, LLC. The corporate maneuvering required over the next 48 hours was grueling. The National Bank held the note, and their primary motivation was speed. They wanted the distressed asset off their quarterly balance sheets before the fiscal review on Friday. David had to leverage my firm's institutional reputation to get us in the room, all while keeping my personal identity shielded behind thick layers of non-disclosure agreements. We offered the bank a strategic premium over the Apex Holdings bid, structuring it as an all-cash transaction that would bypass the usual underwriting delays. I sat in my office late into the night, drinking cold coffee, reviewing the acquisition contracts line by line. Every single clause had to be bulletproof. One leaked document, one careless email from the bank's servicing department, and my parents would discover their daughter was orchestrating their financial ruin. Apex Holdings did not surrender easily. They were a ruthless development firm used to bullying local municipalities. When they realized a shadow buyer was encroaching on their territory, they threatened to tie the bank up in litigation over the preliminary agreements. I countered by instructing David to increase our cash escrow deposit, demonstrating liquidity that Apex could not match without seeking board approval. The clock ticked down. We needed the bank executives to formally abandon the Apex deal and ratify our purchase before the Friday deadline. The tension in my chest felt like a coiled spring. On Wednesday afternoon, while waiting for the bank's final verdict, I walked down to a quiet coffee shop in Buckhead. I had a scheduled meeting with my sister-in-law, Maya. Maya was a rare anomaly in our social circle. She was a brilliant, grounded entrepreneur who had built a highly successful luxury logistics company from the ground up. When Preston married her 3 years ago, my parents assumed her business was a cute little hobby, much like my career. They severely underestimated her intellect and her survival instincts. She arrived 5 minutes early, wearing a sharp, tailored suit, her expression calm but unreadable. We ordered our drinks and found a corner booth tucked away from the street-facing windows. The ambient noise of espresso machines and quiet conversations offered a layer of privacy. Maya did not waste time with pleasantries. She took a slow sip of her black coffee and looked directly at me across the small wooden table. Preston was supposed to pay the venue deposit for his yacht club induction ceremony this morning, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. The club manager called my office directly because Preston's primary card declined. I looked at her, keeping my face neutral, though my mind raced. That sounds like an administrative error, I offered, playing the polite Southern game we were both forced to endure at family gatherings. Maya offered a thin, knowing smile. Her dark eyes locked onto mine. Do not treat me like Caroline Genevieve. I know what an administrative error looks like. I also know what insolvency looks like. She set her cup down, resting her manicured hands on the table. I have spent the last month quietly auditing our joint accounts. The numbers are terrifying. He is floating debt on high-interest personal loans to cover his lifestyle. I am separating my business capital from his personal ledgers by Friday morning. I am taking my company, my hard-earned assets, and I am building an unbreachable firewall. I listened to her, feeling a profound sense of respect. Maya was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, and instead of rearranging the deck chairs like the rest of the family, she was methodically building a lifeboat. You are being smart, I told her. The current economic climate is unpredictable. You need to protect your hard work. She leaned back, studying my face with a forensic intensity. You are the only one in that bloodline who understands consequences, Genevieve. I see the way you watch them at those parties. Watch your own back. Preston is going to look for a bailout soon, and he will drag you under if you let him. I thanked her, paid the bill, and walked back to my office. Maya's warning verified everything I had seen on my dual monitors. The collapse was accelerating much faster than I anticipated. If Preston was bouncing checks at the prestigious yacht club, my parents were likely mere days away from their own public humiliations. I rode the elevator up to the 30th floor, my pulse steadying into a calm, rhythmic beat. I walked into my suite and saw David waiting by my desk. He held a thick manila envelope bearing the bank's official seal. The board accepted the counteroffer, David said, sliding the heavy documents across the glass surface. Apex Holdings officially withdrew their bid when we proved our cash position. The directors ratified the sale of the distressed asset package to Peach State Holdings, LLC. All we need is your final signature and the wire transfer authorization. Once those funds clear the Federal Reserve, you own the note. The historic property, the primary debt, the land underneath it, it all belongs to your holding company. I picked up my favorite heavy brass pen. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a sudden wave of guilt or second-guess my motives. My family had spent my entire life diminishing my achievements, and this was the mathematical result of their hubris. I flipped to the last page of the dense legal packet and signed my name with precise, sharp strokes. I logged into my secured banking portal, bypassed the dual authentication prompts, and initiated the wire transfer. Millions of dollars Capital I had ruthlessly earned and saved over 7 years in the cutthroat finance sector vanished from my personal accounts, and flowed into the bank's escrow. I stared at the screen, my heart beating in my throat, waiting for the system to process the movement of wealth. I watched the confirmation screen load. A green check mark appeared. The transaction was irrevocable. I owned the Savannah estate. My parents were no longer the proud lords of an antebellum manor. They were oblivious squatters residing in a property owned by my corporate entity. The shift in power was invisible to the outside world, hidden inside encrypted servers and county legal filings, but it was undeniable. I thanked David, locked the physical documents in my wall safe, and sat alone in the quiet office, savoring the profound stillness of victory. The trap was set. The house was mine. The silence was shattered by the shrill ringing of my cell phone. I glanced at the glowing screen. Caroline Frank. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, centering my emotions before answering. "Hello, Mother." Her voice burst through the speaker, breathless and practically vibrating with unearned joy. "Genevieve, darling, I just had to call and share the wonderful news. The interior designer just left the house. We finalized the blueprints." Blueprints for what I asked, turning my chair to face the Atlanta skyline, pulling up her empty bank statements on my monitor. "The new sunroom," she declared, her tone echoing with sheer delusion. "We are tearing out the east patio and installing a fully enclosed, climate-controlled conservatory. Imported Italian glass marble flooring, the works. It is going to cost $150,000, but Richard agrees the house simply demands it to maintain our standard." The construction crew arrives to start demolition next week. I stared at my phone long after Caroline ended the call. $150,000 for a sunroom. The number echoed in my head, bouncing against the hard mathematical reality of the $2.5 million deficit flashing on my monitor. There was no liquid capital left in their accounts. Preston was bouncing checks for routine country club dues. My mother had just commissioned imported Italian glass and custom marble flooring. Money did not just materialize out of thin air, not even for the Frank family. I opened the newly transferred primary file for the Savannah estate. Peach State Holdings owned the debt now, but the administrative transition period meant I finally had unhindered access to every single piece of correspondence, credit inquiry, and financial probing associated with the property address. I ran a deep forensic sweep on the parcel number, checking for pending inquiries that might have slipped through the cracks during the rapid bank transfer. My screen refreshed a few moments later. A cold knot formed in my stomach as the new data populated. My father, Richard, had not just been sitting idle while the National Bank prepared to foreclose. He had gone hunting in the financial shadows. The search results revealed a highly active pending title inquiry from a firm called Blackwood Financial. They were not a traditional bank or a standard mortgage lender. They were a predatory, high-interest bridge loan outfit. They were the kind of shadowy organization that operated on the fringes of the law, preying on desperate debtors by offering fast cash at exorbitant interest rates, always secured by aggressive property liens. I opened the inquiry details and read through the preliminary loan application Richard had submitted earlier that week. My father had engaged this shadow lender to secure a $200,000 bridge loan. To get the preliminary approval, he had submitted a fraudulent equity estimate. He had clearly hired a corrupt local appraiser, likely one of his old golf partners from the country club, to artificially inflate the current market value of the Savannah estate. The fake appraisal conveniently omitted the 3 existing mortgages and the active foreclosure status. Richard was using this illegal high-risk loan to fund my mother's extravagant sunroom renovation and float their outward lifestyle for another few months. The legal implications of this discovery were terrifying. If Blackwood Financial managed to finalize their paperwork and attach a new lien to the property before the county clerk officially recorded my master deed transfer, my entire acquisition could be contested in a grueling court battle. Predatory lenders were notorious for dragging out title disputes for years, trapping properties in endless litigation until the primary note holder settled for a heavy payout. My father's desperate, fraudulent maneuver threatened to paralyze my corporate entity and jeopardize the millions of dollars I had just wired from my personal accounts. I did not panic. Panic was an emotion reserved for people who did not understand how to use leverage. I picked up my office line and called David, my corporate attorney. "We have a secondary threat on the Savannah asset," I told him, keeping my voice clipped and precise. "Richard Frank is attempting to secure a fraudulent bridge loan through Blackwood Financial. They are moving to place a fresh lien on the property. We need to block them before they file anything with the county clerk." I heard the rapid clicking of David typing on his keyboard. "Blackwood is a tough outfit," he warned, his tone turning serious. "They specialize in dirty title fights. If they get a legal claim on that parcel, they will tie Peach State Holdings up in a jurisdictional nightmare. We need to cut them off at the knees today." "Do it," I instructed. "Accelerate the primary debt." In the cutthroat world of distressed asset acquisitions, debt acceleration is a nuclear option. By invoking the acceleration clause embedded deep in the original mortgage contract I now owned, I was legally demanding the immediate, full repayment of the $2.5 million balance due to sustained default. More importantly, executing this specific clause triggered a strict corporate subordination lock on the property title. It meant no secondary lender could legally attach a new claim without assuming the entirety of the primary debt first. I spent the next 6 hours drafting the legal barricade. David and I combed through every line of the Blackwood Financial Inquiry. We prepared a relentless cease and desist order, laced with undeniable proof of Richard's fraudulent appraisal. We did not just ask the shadow lender to step away politely. We built a paper guillotine. We fired the heavy legal documents over to Blackwood's compliance department. The notice explicitly stated that Peach State Holdings was the senior lien holder, that the property was currently in accelerated default, and that any attempt to attach a new loan would result in immediate federal fraud reporting regarding the manipulated equity estimates. We trapped them in a tight corner where proceeding with my father's loan would make their firm directly complicit in felony bank fraud. The response was almost instantaneous. Predatory lenders loved easy targets, but they despised federal scrutiny and superior corporate leverage. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Blackwood Financial formally withdrew their loan approval. They dissolved the pending lien and scrubbed their inquiry from the county registry. I sat back in my chair, the tension finally releasing from my jaw. I had successfully navigated the legal minefield my father had blindly planted. The master deed was now unassailable. I held the sole uncontested claim to the Savannah estate. No shadow lenders, no commercial developers, and certainly no members of the Frank family could challenge my ownership. The house was secured. Now the corporate machinery had to follow standard protocol. Whenever a mortgage is bought or sold, federal law dictates that the new servicing entity must notify the residing occupants. It is a mandatory administrative step designed to protect consumers. My automated system generated the standard change of servicer letter. The document was printed, sealed in a crisp white envelope bearing the discreet Peach State Holdings logo, and dispatched via certified mail to the Savannah address. The letter explicitly stated that the previous national bank no longer held the debt, and that all future correspondence and financial obligations were officially transferred to the new holding company. I monitored the postal tracking number over the weekend. On Monday morning, the carrier confirmed successful delivery. I knew my parents' habits well. Richard handled the mail, usually filtering out the final notices and hiding them in his study to maintain the fragile illusion of control over his household. I waited for the inevitable phone call. I expected unhinged rage. I expected my father to demand answers about this mysterious new holding company that had bought his debt. Instead, my phone remained entirely silent. Curiosity got the better of me. I logged into the secure server that monitored the estate's incoming communication. There were no panicked emails to the old bank. There were no frantic calls to their legal counsel. The silence was baffling and deeply out of character for a man who liked to loudly threaten anyone who challenged his authority. It was not until Tuesday evening that I discovered the true reason for their silence. I was leaving the office, walking toward the parking garage, when Preston sent a text message to the extended family group chat. He attached a bright photograph taken on the grand wraparound porch. Richard and Caroline were holding crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. They looked radiant, relieved, bathed in the golden hour light of the coastal sunset. The caption underneath the photo made me stop walking. Preston had typed, "Celebrating a miracle today. The bank finally realized their accounting errors. Debt wiped clean. The Frank legacy is untouchable." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words again to ensure my tired eyes were not playing tricks on me. They had received the certified change of servicer letter. They had opened the envelope and read the formal notice stating that their previous bank had closed their account and relinquished the massive debt. But instead of reading the second paragraph, which clearly introduced Peach State Holdings as the new owner of their financial ruin, their staggering arrogance had led them to a deeply delusional conclusion. They believed the original bank had simply given up. They interpreted the mandatory account closure as a miraculous clerical error, assuming their long-standing social prestige and family name had somehow intimidated a national financial institution into writing off $2.5 million. They genuinely thought they were free and clear. They thought the historic house was safe. They were drinking expensive champagne on a porch my company owned, celebrating a victory that did not exist in the real world. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have replied. I could have shattered their pathetic illusion right then and there with a single devastating sentence. But the eviction clock had already started ticking down in my system. Let them drink their champagne, I decided, sliding the phone into my purse. Let them believe the universe had bent to their entitled will. The higher they built their pedestal of denial, the harder the concrete would feel when I finally pulled the foundation out from under them. The drive south from Atlanta was a descent into a suffocating heat. The summer sun baked the Georgia asphalt, radiating invisible waves that distorted the horizon. By the time I reached the coastal city limits, the heavy scent of salt and marsh water filled the cabin of my sedan. I turned onto the familiar oak-lined street, feeling a cold detachment settle over my nerves. The estate loomed at the end of the long gravel drive, practically glowing under strategic landscape lighting. My parents had wasted no time. Driven by the sheer delusion that their financial slate had been miraculously wiped clean by a clerical error, they had orchestrated a summer garden party of staggering proportions. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for the arriving Savannah elite. I tossed my keys to a waiting attendant and walked toward the noise. The scent of roasted lamb and expensive floral arrangements hung heavy in the evening air, masking the underlying rot of their financial reality. They were showing off the new sunroom, or rather they were showing off the framework of it. I navigated through the throng of silk dresses and tailored seersucker suits, my eyes tracking the extravagant details. A string quartet played on the veranda, their bows moving in perfect synchronization. Waiters navigated the dense crowd with silver trays piled high with caviar and truffles. My mother Caroline fluttered near the newly installed Italian glass doors of her unearned conservatory. She wore a striking ivory gown, laughing brightly as she pointed out the imported marble flooring to a cluster of envious neighbors. She was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She truly believed she had outsmarted the banking system. The reality, of course, was that the marble beneath her designer heels legally belonged to Peach State Holdings, LLC. Richard stood near the center of the manicured lawn, a fresh cigar clamped between his teeth. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, holding court just as he always did. When he spotted me standing near the edge of the patio, a familiar, condescending smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He raised a hand, demanding the attention of his peers. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The sharp, high chime cut through the ambient chatter. The string quartet faded into silence. The local elite turned their attention to the patriarch of the Frank family. Friends, neighbors, family. Richard began his voice projecting across the lawn with practiced theatricality. We gather tonight to celebrate endurance in a world that constantly changes, a world that forgets the value of true heritage. This estate stands as a testament to the Frank legacy. He raised his glass higher. The crowd murmured in polite agreement. There were rumors he continued, offering a magnanimous chuckle that sounded like grinding stones. Whispers of financial discomfort. But let me assure you, old money does not bend to temporary economic wins. The banks recognize permanence. Our foundation is unbreakable. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the attendees before landing squarely on me. The air around me seemed to drop several degrees. The crowd followed his line of sight. Some of our own Richard said, his tone dripping with patronizing sorrow. Choose to walk away from this tradition. They run off to the city, chasing modest little paychecks, abandoning the deep roots that built this town. But tonight is proof that tradition prevails over the modern corporate grind. I held his gaze. I did not shift my weight. I did not look away in shame. I stood on the very grass he was falsely claiming, listening to him dig his own grave with a silver spoon. The guests offered a scattered round of applause, a few of them casting sympathetic glances in my direction. They thought I was a tragic disappointment. I knew I was their landlord. A firm hand gripped my elbow, pulling me out of the line of sight. I turned and saw Maya. My sister-in-law looked pristine in a tailored navy sheath dress, but the tension around her eyes betrayed a fierce, calculating energy. She did not say a word, simply guiding me through the kitchen doors, past the chaotic prep stations, and into the dim, quiet confines of the walk-in pantry. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, muting the sounds of the celebration outside. Maya leaned against the wooden shelving, crossing her arms. The air in the pantry smelled of dried herbs and citrus. "Do not let him get to you," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "He is performing for a ghost town." I leaned against the opposite wall, brushing a speck of dust from my blazer. "I am not bothered, Maya. It is just theater." "It is a crumbling theater," she corrected, her dark eyes flashing with sharp intelligence. "You see the catering staff out there, the ones serving the imported lamb." I nodded. "They look tense." "They are tense because the catering director cornered your father an hour before the guests arrived," Maya revealed, pulling a sleek phone from her clutch to check a notification. She demanded a cashier's check up front. Richard tried to pay with a corporate card, and it declined. Then he tried a personal check. The caterer refused to accept it. Word is spreading through the local vendor network. Richard has bounced checks at the florist, the country club, and the local yacht broker, all in the same week. The only reason the staff is serving food right now is because Preston emptied his last remaining credit limit to cover the deposit. Maya placed her phone back into her bag. The metallic clasp snapped shut with a decisive sound that echoed in the small room. "I am finalizing my exit," she stated flatly. "My attorney drafted the separation papers yesterday. I have secured all my business accounts. Preston thinks I am just reorganizing my corporate structure for tax purposes. By the time he realizes the firewall is up, I will be gone. I refuse to let this family drag my logistics firm down into their sinkhole." "You are doing the right thing," I told her, feeling a surge of genuine respect. "Timing is everything. Make sure your exit is clean." "I will," Maya replied, her posture straightening. "You should leave before they ask you to sign a loan guarantor form. The desperation is going to peak soon." We exited the pantry, slipping back into the humid evening air. I walked around the perimeter of the lawn, keeping to the shadows near the old oak trees. Through the tall glass windows of the grand parlor, I watched my parents. The string quartet had transitioned into a slow, sweeping waltz. Richard and Caroline were dancing in the center of the room. They looked elegant, timeless, and utterly doomed. They were swaying to the music, smiling at each other, convinced they had secured their aristocratic future. They were passengers, dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, cheering for the iceberg. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I walked down the gravel driveway, got into my car, and drove back to the cold, rational reality of Atlanta. The weekend faded into the precise routine of Monday morning. I sat at my desk on the 30th floor, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. My fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the Peach State Holdings primary servicing portal. The automated administrative grace period had officially expired at midnight. It was time to correct the ledger. I opened the billing interface for the Savannah estate. I overrode the previous National Bank's outdated payment schedule, which my parents had ignored for nearly a year. I generated the first adjusted mortgage statement under the new corporate ownership. Operating strictly within the legal bounds of the original contract, I doubled the minimum monthly payment to account for the unaddressed penalties. Below that staggering figure, I added a strict demand for the immediate clearance of all historical arrears. The total amount due was catastrophic. I hit the enter key. The system routed the devastating financial demand to the mailroom for overnight delivery. The false victory was over. The paper trail had caught up to them. The passage of time in the financial sector is not measured in days or weeks. It is measured in compounding interest. Every morning before the sun crested over the Atlanta skyline, I booted up my secure terminal and accessed the Peach State Holdings primary ledger. I watched the numbers tick upward. The adjusted mortgage statement I sent following their extravagant summer garden party had arrived in Savannah. I knew it arrived because the certified mail receipt required a signature, and the digital scan showed my father's familiar, hurried scrawl. Richard and Caroline responded to the devastating financial demand the exact same way they responded to every unpleasant reality in their lives. They ignored it. In their minds, the first notice from the previous bank was a clerical error. Therefore, this new demand from an unknown holding company had to be a continuation of that same mistake, perhaps a bureaucratic echo. True to form, they chose the comfort of denial over the friction of truth. I sat at my desk, sipping dark roast coffee, tracking the late fees accruing in real time on my corporate dashboard. It was a quiet, mathematical countdown to their ruin. Every 30 days, the system automatically generated a new penalty. The red font on the screen grew larger, thicker, heavier. They were building their own coffin, and I was simply providing the nails. The minor conflict, the pebble that precedes the landslide, arrived on a humid Thursday evening. I was in my Atlanta apartment. My home was the antithesis of the Savannah estate. There were no antique chandeliers, no suffocating velvet drapes, and no ghosts of Southern aristocracy. My space featured clean modern lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture I bought with my own hard-earned capital. I was reviewing a separate commercial portfolio when a sharp, impatient knock rattled my front door. The building concierge usually announced visitors. A bypass meant someone had slipped past the lobby desk during a shift change. I walked to the foyer and checked the security camera feed. Preston stood in the hallway. He was pacing, checking his phone, running a hand through his hair. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My older brother looked like a man trying to outrun a storm. He wore a designer blazer, but the fabric was slightly wrinkled. His luxury watch gleamed under the hallway lights, but his eyes were bloodshot. He forced a wide, artificial grin the moment he saw me. "Genevieve," he declared, stepping into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the minimalist living room, his nose wrinkling slightly in distaste. "Nice place. A bit sterile for my taste, but I suppose it works for a single woman in the city." I kept my hand on the doorknob. "What are you doing here, Preston? It is an 8-hour round trip from the coast." He brushed past me, walking toward the kitchen island. "Just doing a little networking in the metropolitan area," he said smoothly, leaning against the quartz counter, "meeting with some venture capitalists." Which brings me to you, actually. I am offering you an opportunity, a chance to get in on the ground floor of something revolutionary. I closed the door slowly. An opportunity. Preston pulled a sleek tablet from his leather portfolio. He swiped a screen displaying a colorful but remarkably vague presentation. It is a groundbreaking tech startup, he explained, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a desperate salesman. We are disrupting the luxury logistics supply chain. The projections are off the charts. The board is opening a limited seed round for family and close associates. I convinced the directors to carve out a small allocation just for you. I stood on the opposite side of the island. He was pitching a logistics company. Maya ran a logistics company. He was trying to mirror his soon-to-be ex-wife's success, likely because she had already severed their joint accounts and cut off his primary funding source. The venture capitalists he mentioned did not exist. The board directors did not exist. It was a hollow shell. A desperate attempt to scrape together cash to float his sinking lifestyle. How much is the allocation? I asked, my tone flat. A measly $20,000, Preston replied, waving his hand as if the sum was loose change found in a sofa cushion. It is a drop in the bucket for the return you will see by the fourth quarter. Plus, it gives you a chance to finally build some real wealth instead of just collecting a modest corporate paycheck. I looked at the tablet, then up at his face. The subtle tremor in his hands was worse than it had been at the gala. I am not investing in a shell company, Preston. The answer is no. His artificial smile fractured. The charming facade shattered, revealing the toxic entitlement underneath. What do you mean, no? I am handing you a golden ticket, Genevieve. I mean, I am not giving you $20,000 to pay your delinquent country club tabs and float your sinking car lease, I stated, keeping my voice low and steady. I know Maya separated her accounts. I know the catering staff demanded a cashier's check at the garden party. Your credit is toxic. The startup is a phantom. Preston slammed his hand onto the quartz counter. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet apartment. You arrogant little failure, he snarled, his face flushing dark red. You sit up here in your sterile glass box, pretending you understand how the world works. You have no concept of legacy. You have no concept of wealth. I am trying to pull you up to make you a real part of this family, and you spit in my face. You are selfish. You always have been. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. This is why you will always be a secondary character in this family. You lack vision. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I let his insult hang in the air, pathetic and weightless. I walked over to the front door and pulled it open, gesturing toward the hallway. The exit is right there, Preston, I said. He glared at me, his chest heaving. He snatched his tablet off the counter and stormed toward the door. You are going to regret this, he muttered, stepping over the threshold. When this company goes public, do not come begging for a handout. I shut the door, turning the deadbolt until it clicked. I leaned against the heavy wood, feeling a cold sense of finality. He was weeks away from personal bankruptcy. Maya was divorcing him, the lenders were circling, and yet he clung to the illusion of superiority because it was the only thing he had left. I walked back to my home office and booted up my laptop. The encounter with my brother erased any lingering trace of hesitation. The Frank family operated on the assumption that rules did not apply to them, that deadlines were mere suggestions for the lower classes. It was time to teach them the unforgiving nature of a legal contract. Weeks passed. The humid summer began to fade into a crisp autumn. Richard and Caroline ignored the second adjusted mortgage statement. They ignored the third. My corporate system logged every missed payment, every ignored certified letter, and every accrued penalty. They continued to host their afternoon tea parties on the veranda, showing off the newly installed Italian glass of their unpaid conservatory, entirely oblivious to the ticking clock. In the foreclosure industry, there is a very specific statutory timeline. A borrower is typically granted a strict window to cure their default. My holding company, operating strictly by the book, provided the maximum legal allowance to ensure our claim was airtight. On a Tuesday morning, the 90-day grace period officially expired. The digital timer on my dashboard reached 0. The system interface shifted from warning colors to a solid, undeniable black. The administrative phase was over. We were now entering the legal execution phase. I picked up the phone and dialed my attorney, David. He answered on the first ring. The 90-day clock just hit 0, I told him. The debtors have made 0 attempts to cure the arrears. They have ignored all certified correspondence. Understood, David replied, his tone shifting into professional gear. We are clear to proceed. Shall I initiate the formal filing? Yes, I commanded. File it, today. David drafted the heavy legal paperwork. The notice of default is not a polite request for payment. It is a severe, public, and irreversible legal declaration. It strips away the private nature of the debt and places the delinquency on the public record. It is the formal initiation of the eviction process. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a courier delivered the document to the Chatham County Courthouse. The county clerk stamped the paperwork, registering the notice of default against the historic Savannah estate. The action was permanent. The Frank family's financial ruin was no longer a secret hidden in my encrypted servers. It was a matter of public record, waiting to detonate their carefully curated social standing. The trap had snapped shut. There was no going back. The publication of a legal notice in Chatham County is a quiet event that produces a deafening echo. Savannah is a city constructed entirely on whispers and polite observations. When the county clerk stamped the notice of default for the Frank estate, the information did not stay confined to the courthouse filing cabinets. It migrated into the daily registry of local legal proceedings. From there, it spilled into the local real estate newsletters, the country club locker rooms, and the hushed conversations over afternoon tea. My parents had spent decades cultivating an image of untouchable prestige. Now their financial ruin was printed in black and white for their peers to read over morning coffee. I knew the exact moment the reality of the filing breached the thick walls of my father's denial. It happened late on a Thursday evening. I was sitting on my balcony watching the headlights trace lines across the Atlanta highway when my phone vibrated against the metal table. The caller identification displayed my father's private cell phone number. Richard Frank rarely called me. If he needed to communicate with his daughter, he usually relayed the message through my mother or Preston, treating me like a distant acquaintance who occasionally required managing. A direct phone call from his private line meant the situation had bypassed his ability to delegate. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. I did not offer a warm greeting. I simply said, "Hello, Genevieve." His voice came through the speaker, tight and brittle. The rich, booming cadence he used to command boardrooms and garden parties was gone. He sounded out of breath, as though he had just run up a flight of stairs. In the background, I heard the faint clinking of ice against crystal. He was drinking. And judging by the muffled acoustics of the room, he was hiding in his mahogany study, with the door firmly locked. "Hello, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Is everything all right down on the coast?" He ignored the question, diving straight into a frantic, disjointed explanation. "We are dealing with a ridiculous administrative headache down here," he began, trying to inject a tone of casual annoyance into his trembling voice. "Some rogue holding company is causing trouble with the estate paperwork. It is a massive misunderstanding, of course. A clerical error that got out of hand because some low-level bureaucrat wants to make a name for himself." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, forcing him to fill the void. "It is called Peach State Holdings," he continued, "the name of my own LLC, sounding foreign and desperate coming from his mouth. They bought out our original note a few months back. We thought the matter was settled. We assumed they recognized the value of the Frank name and cleared the ledger. But today, we received a rather insulting legal document from the county. They filed a public notice. It is causing a minor stir among the neighbors. It is highly inappropriate. A public notice of default is standard operating procedure for delinquent accounts, I stated calmly, offering the clinical perspective of a finance director. It means the servicer is moving to secure the asset. I do not need a lecture on banking procedures from a mid-level desk worker, Richard snapped, his temper flaring to mask his terror. I need you to make yourself useful for once. You work in that corporate financial machine up there in Atlanta. You know people who know people. You understand how these faceless shell companies operate. What exactly are you asking me to do? I asked, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. I need names, Genevieve, he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I need you to use your modest finance connections to bypass the corporate veil. Peach State Holdings is a ghost. My attorneys cannot find a single executive listed on their public filings. Everything is hidden behind registered agents and privacy trusts. I need to know who is sitting at the top of this operation. And what will you do when you find them? I inquired. I am going to have a face-to-face conversation with them, he growled, the ice clinking violently in his glass. I am going to remind them exactly who they are dealing with. People do not just march into Savannah and threaten the Frank family. I will ruin their reputation in this state. I will tie them up in so much local litigation, they will be begging to drop the claim. I just need you to dig into your little corporate databases and hand me their names. The irony was exquisite. The untouchable Southern patriarch, the man who had mocked my career and dismissed my lifestyle for years, was now calling me in secret to beg for my professional skills. He wanted me to hunt down the elusive executive destroying his life, entirely unaware that the executive was currently listening to him unravel over the phone. I can make a few inquiries, I said, playing the role of the dutiful but detached daughter. Corporate structures like that are designed to repel casual searches, but I have access to distressed asset registries. I will look into it and see what surfaces. The promise of assistance, however vague, seemed to break the last remaining dam holding back his anxiety. The arrogant demands dissolved into a pathetic stream of excuses. Richard began to monologue, the bourbon loosening his tongue. He paced around his study, his breathing ragged. It is this cursed economy, Genevieve, he rambled. The traditional markets are broken. The banks lack loyalty. We have banked with the same institutions for 3 generations, and the moment liquidity tightens, they sell our heritage to some predatory vulture fund without a second thought. It is disgraceful. And your mother, she simply does not understand the pressure I am under to maintain our standard. The renovations, the parties, the social obligations, it all falls on my shoulders. I listened to the facade crumble. He blamed the national banking sector. He blamed the local real estate market. He even subtly blamed Caroline for her extravagant tastes, conveniently ignoring his own fleet of luxury vehicles and the fraudulent bridge loans he had attempted to secure. Nothing was his fault. He was a victim of a changing world, a noble aristocrat under siege by greedy corporations. He sounded old. The booming titan of Savannah society was reduced to a frightened man hiding in his office, drinking cheap bourbon because his credit cards could no longer purchase the top-shelf brands. He was trapped in a prison of his own construction, and the walls were rapidly closing in. We just need a little more time, Richard muttered, almost talking to himself now. If I can just get the executives on the phone, I can negotiate a private settlement. I can leverage the equity in the commercial properties downtown. You do not own any commercial properties downtown, I reminded him softly. You sold those 10 years ago to fund Preston's failed restaurant venture. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. He knew I was right. He had exhausted every single lifeline, burned every bridge, and spent every dime of generational wealth he had inherited. There were no hidden reserves left to tap. I need those names, Genevieve, he whispered, the fight draining out of his voice. Please. I am running out of options here. I will run the search tomorrow morning, I lied smoothly, feeling the cold metal of the balcony railing beneath my hand. Just stay calm, Richard. Let the legal process play out. These holding companies move slowly. You probably have months before any physical action is taken. That is the problem, he blurted out, his panic overriding his filter. The fear stripped away his final layer of caution. He had not intended to tell me the full extent of the danger, but the bourbon and the desperation forced the truth out of his mouth. They are not moving slowly, Richard confessed, his breath hitching. The public filing was not just a warning. We received a physical courier package this morning, right after the notice hit the papers. The holding company did not grant a standard negotiation window. They accelerated the entire timeline, based on some obscure clause in the tertiary mortgage. My pulse steadied. The automated system had executed my exact legal parameters perfectly. "What did the courier package say?" I asked, prompting him to read his own death sentence. Richard took a shaky breath. "They gave us a final ultimatum. 10 days. If the balance is not cleared in exactly 10 days, Peach State Holdings is sending the county sheriff to the estate to execute a public eviction." 10 days, Genevieve. I need those names tonight, or we are going to be thrown out onto the street. The 10-day countdown was a quiet, invisible pendulum swinging over the Savannah estate. Every sunrise brought my parents closer to the physical reality of their financial collapse. They had spent their entire adult lives believing that consequence was a concept reserved for other people. Now the ticking clock was deafening. I sat in my Atlanta office monitoring the Peach State Holdings servers. There were no new legal filings. There were no incoming communications from their attorneys. The silence from the coast was unnatural, heavy with the frantic energy of trapped animals looking for a way out. The break in the silence came on a Friday afternoon. My desk phone remained quiet, but my personal cell phone illuminated with an incoming call. The screen displayed Maya. I picked up the device and answered. "Hello, Maya, Genevieve." Her voice came through the speaker, crisp and taut, with barely suppressed disgust. "Are you sitting down?" "I am at my desk," I replied, turning my chair away from the monitors to look out over the city skyline. "What is happening in Savannah?" "I am parked 2 blocks away from the estate," Maya said, the ambient noise of passing coastal traffic filtering through the connection. "I drove by the house 15 minutes ago. There is an unmarked white box truck sitting in the circular driveway. It does not belong to a plumbing service or a landscaping company. It belongs to a private estate liquidator." I gripped the phone tighter. "A liquidator." "They are holding a fire sale," Maya confirmed. I sat in my car and watched 2 men carry the 19th century silver tea service out the front door. The same tea service Caroline claims is the crown jewel of her heritage. Then they brought out the antique mahogany sideboard from the formal dining room. They carried out 3 gilded oil paintings, including the portrait of your great-grandfather. Your parents are selling off the actual Frank legacy for quick cash. A cold wave of realization washed over me. The delusion had finally cracked, but instead of facing the truth, Richard and Caroline were choosing to hollow out their own home. They were pawning the ancestral heirlooms they had spent decades bragging about. They were stripping the house bare to raise capital, desperately trying to gather enough money to halt the eviction notice they had received from my company. "It gets worse," Maya continued, her tone dropping into a bitter register. "A neighbor walked her dog past the driveway while they were loading the truck. I watched your mother step out onto the porch. Caroline actually smiled, waved, and told the neighbor she was simply sending a few old pieces out for professional restoration before the autumn social season. She stood there, watching her heritage get stuffed into the back of a rented van, and lied with perfect posture. Then I saw the private dealer hand Richard a thick, unmarked envelope. They are taking cash payouts. The sheer hypocrisy was staggering. They had mocked my quiet corporate career, treating my financial stability as a vulgar pursuit, while they were secretly fencing their own family history in the driveway like common thieves. "Selling the antiques is a futile gesture," I told Maya, doing the mental arithmetic in my head. Even if they liquidate every piece of valuable furniture in that house, they might scrape together $100,000. The private market for antique silver and oil paintings is depressed, and liquidators take a steep commission. It will not even cover the late fees on the primary arrears. The debt is astronomical.
I know, Maya said, and Richard knows it too. That envelope of cash is just a temporary bandage to keep the utilities turned on and the country club account active for another week. But they have a larger strategy in motion. That is the real reason I am calling you. I listened closely, the hum of the office servers fading into the background.
I am out, Geneviève Maya announced, a profound sense of relief finally bleeding into her voice. I filed the paperwork at the courthouse this morning. My attorney intercepted Preston as he was leaving the yacht club. He has been formally served with the divorce decree. My logistics firm is legally insulated. My personal accounts are locked. I have severed every single financial tie to your brother. The firewall is secure.
I let out a slow breath. I am glad, Maya. You built an incredible business. You deserve to protect it.
Preston is currently losing his mind, she revealed, devoid of any sympathy. He called me 20 times in the last hour. He thought my wealth was his safety net. He thought he could use my corporate credit to float his phantom tech startup. Now that he realizes I am gone, the panic is spreading. He drove straight to the estate to tell your parents that their primary source of backup capital has evaporated. I followed him there, keeping my distance. I walked up to the side garden to see if he was going to cause a scene. The side garden ran parallel to my father's mahogany study. The windows were often left cracked open to let in the ocean breeze.
I heard them talking, Maya explained, her voice hardening. They are terrified. The antique money is a drop in the bucket, and the 10-day eviction clock is running out. Preston told them his credit is destroyed. Richard is blacklisted from every reputable lending institution in the state. Caroline cannot even secure a store credit card. They realized they have zero leverage and zero liquidity. But then your father brought up your name. A chill traced its way down my spine.
They know you have a pristine financial record, Maya warned. They know you hold a senior director position at a major Atlanta firm. They discussed your credit score like it was a natural resource they had a right to mine. Richard told Caroline that the only way to save the historic house is to secure a towering personal loan to cover the immediate arrears. Since none of them can qualify, they decided you are going to sign the promissory note.
They want me to act as their prime borrower, I stated, feeling the sheer audacity of their plan settle into my bones.
Yes, Maya confirmed. They want to use your flawless credit history to secure a high-interest personal liability in your name. They are going to frame it as your absolute duty to the family. They plan to ambush you, manipulate you, and guilt you into signing a guarantor application. They think because you have always been the quiet, compliant daughter, they can bully you into handing over your financial future to save their sinking ship.
They are remarkably delusional, I murmured, picturing my mother plotting my ruin while standing in a house stripped of its silver.
Watch your back, Geneviève, Maya advised, her tone shifting into a firm farewell. They are coming for you. I am driving back to my warehouse to brief my security team. I will not be attending any more Frank family gatherings. Good luck. Thank you, Maya. Stay safe. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the glass desk. The sheer gravity of their toxic plan hung in the cold office air. They had spent my entire life dismissing my worth, treating my existence as a mild embarrassment because I chose hard work over social pretense. Now that their grand illusion was collapsing, they viewed my hard work as nothing more than a lifeboat they could hijack. They expected me to chain myself to their $2.5 million anchor and drown alongside them. I did not feel angry. Anger implies a loss of control. I felt a sharp, unyielding sense of purpose. They wanted to use my financial acumen to save their estate, entirely oblivious to the fact that my financial acumen had already purchased the estate out from under them. An hour later, my cell phone chimed. A new text message illuminated the screen. The sender was Caroline. I opened the notification. The message was brief, devoid of warmth, and dripping with thinly veiled manipulation. "Genevieve," she had typed, "we are hosting a mandatory emergency family dinner this Saturday evening at the house. Your attendance is required. We have urgent matters of heritage to discuss. Do not make plans." I stared at the glowing text, a summons. It was not an invitation, it was a demand. They had set the stage for their ambush. They planned to seat me at the formal dining table, serve a meal paid for with pawned silver, and slide a predatory loan application across the mahogany wood. They expected me to fold. They expected the obedient, overlooked daughter to sacrifice her livelihood to maintain their country club facade. I typed a single word in response. Understood. I locked my phone and turned back to my dual monitors. I pulled up the Peach State Holdings property ledger. I verified the master deed, ensuring every signature, every stamp, and every corporate seal was strictly in order. I opened a new document and began drafting a standard, mathematically precise residential lease agreement. If they wanted to discuss urgent matters of heritage this weekend, I was going to bring the paperwork. The coastal highway melted into the winding oak canopy of the Savannah city limits. The Spanish moss hung low over the road, casting long, fractured shadows across the pavement. I guided my sedan down the familiar gravel driveway, the crushed stone crunching beneath the tires with a rhythmic intensity. From the exterior, the estate retained its deceptive grandeur. Strategic floodlights illuminated the towering white columns, the broad wraparound porch, and the meticulously manicured lawn. The landscaping remained pristine, a desperate facade maintained to deceive the neighbors. However, the illusion fractured the moment I parked my car, climbed the wide front steps, and crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The acoustics of the house had shifted dramatically since my last visit. My heels clicked against the original heart pine floorboards, and the sound echoed sharply, bouncing off walls that were suddenly and noticeably bare. The gilded oil portrait of my great-grandfather no longer hung above the entryway table. A noticeable faded rectangular silhouette marred the expensive silk wallpaper where the painting had rested for decades, a permanent scar of their insolvency. The antique mahogany sideboard, a staple of my childhood, where holiday centerpieces were always displayed, was absent from the adjacent hall. My mother had attempted to mask the barren spaces by placing oversized, inexpensive ferns in the corners, but the attempt only highlighted the hollow nature of the home. They were living inside a shell, pretending the pearl had not already been pawned to a private dealer in a white box truck. I walked into the formal dining room, bracing myself for the performance. The table was set with painstaking precision, a grotesque pantomime of coastal aristocracy. The crystal water glasses caught the light of the overhead chandelier, and the remaining silver cutlery was polished to a mirror finish. Caroline sat at the foot of the long table, wearing a tailored silk blouse, her posture rigidly defensive. Her smile was tight, resembling a grimace more than a greeting. Richard occupied the head seat, nursing a tumbler of cheap bourbon, his face drawn and shadowed by weeks of sleepless anxiety. Preston slouched in the chair opposite mine. He looked ragged, a stark departure from his usual manicured appearance. The flawless coastal playboy aesthetic had dissolved, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed man. The divorce papers Maya served him had clearly taken a toll, severing his access to her thriving logistics wealth. He stared at his empty porcelain plate, tapping a butter knife against the linen tablecloth with a restless, erratic rhythm. He no longer projected the arrogant confidence of a man building a groundbreaking tech startup. He projected the raw, unfiltered fear of a man facing imminent personal bankruptcy. There were no hired servers standing in the periphery, the catering staff, having demanded upfront cash that my parents did not possess, was nowhere to be seen. Caroline carried a heavy ceramic platter from the kitchen herself, setting a tough, overcooked roast in the center of the table. The meal proceeded in suffocating silence. The only sounds were the scraping of knives against plates and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. I chewed a piece of dry meat, offering no small talk, waiting for the inevitable transaction to begin. They had not summoned me to catch up on my life in Atlanta. They had brought me here to harvest my credit score. The ambush commenced the moment Richard pushed his half-eaten plate aside. He cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs in a vain attempt to project his former authority. The local economy is experiencing a temporary liquidity contraction. He began employing the sterile corporate jargon he usually despised to mask his desperation. We are reorganizing our asset portfolio to navigate these turbulent waters. Unfortunately, the traditional lenders are being remarkably short-sighted regarding short-term capital bridges. We need to secure a supplemental liability line to float the estate operating costs while I restructure my commercial holdings and finalize some pending investments. He reached into his tailored blazer pocket and withdrew a thick stack of folded documents. He smoothed the papers flat and slid them across the polished wood. They came to a halt right next to my crystal water glass. The bold black font at the top of the page read, "Personal Guarantor Application and Promissory Note." I glanced at the terms printed below the title. The interest rate was astronomical, a predatory trap designed by a shadow lender who knew traditional banks would never touch their names. "This is a mere formality," Richard insisted, leaning forward, though his eyes darted nervously toward Preston. "The underwriters require a secondary signature from an individual with an unblemished financial history. Since you live a very modest, quiet lifestyle up in the city, your profile is untouched. We need you to co-sign this liability. It is your duty to this family, Genevieve. You turned your back on our traditions for a corporate desk job, but now the heritage requires your assistance to weather the storm." I looked at the predatory contract, noting the blank signature line waiting to destroy my financial future. Then I looked up at my father. I did not reach for the silver pen resting near the documents. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of intimidation. "You are asking me to tether my pristine financial standing to a sinking ship," I stated, my tone devoid of emotion, cutting through the heavy air of the dining room. "Your credit is toxic. Preston is currently facing a divorce that will expose his vast insolvency to a judge. You are pawning the family heirlooms just to keep the lights on, and the country club dues paid. I am not signing a high-interest liability to fund your delusions. The answer is no." The polite veneer evaporated instantly. The masks dropped, revealing the ugly, desperate entitlement underneath. The illusion of a civilized family dinner shattered. Preston slammed his fists onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses and sending a fork clattering to the floor. "You ungrateful little failure," he snarled, his face contorting with a sudden, vicious rage. "You sit in your sterile apartment, working a pathetic desk job, pretending you are better than us. You do not understand what it takes to maintain an empire. You are a footnote in this family. We are offering you a chance to finally contribute to something greater than your measly salary, and you spit on us. You are a coward." Caroline did not try to calm him down. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "We raised you, Genevieve," she hissed, her voice trembling with venom. "We clothed you. We fed you. We gave you a name that opens doors in this state. You owe us every single breath you take. Your entire lifestyle is a direct result of the foundation we built for you. How dare you sit at my table eating my food and judge the way we manage our wealth? You are nothing without this legacy." I absorbed the verbal assault without blinking. They were throwing insults because they had no leverage left. Their rage was a symptom of their powerlessness. "You do not have wealth," I corrected her, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You have debt, and I will not inherit it." Caroline pushed her chair back with such force that it tipped over, crashing against the bare floorboards with a loud crack. She stood up, her face flushed with unhinged fury, her chest heaving. She pointed a trembling finger directly toward the grand foyer and the heavy wooden front door. "If you do not pick up that pen and sign this document right now," she screamed, the sound echoing through the hollow, empty halls of the house, "you will never step foot in my house again." Caroline's words hung in the stale dining room air. "You will never step foot in my house again." I looked at her pointing finger, trembling with unchecked fury. I looked at the overturned chair resting on the bare heart pine floorboards. I did not match her theatrical rage. I did not offer a tearful defense or a bitter counterattack. The Frank family fed on emotional chaos, using it as a smokescreen to hide their failures. I refused to participate in their final performance. I stood up from the table. I picked up my purse, ignoring the predatory loan application sitting untouched next to my crystal water glass. "Goodbye, Caroline," I said. The quiet, even tone of my voice seemed to infuriate her further. I turned and walked out of the formal dining room. I crossed the hollow grand foyer, my heels clicking against the wood, a steady metronome marking the end of my tolerance. Preston shouted something unintelligible from the table, a frantic string of insults, but I did not stop walking. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the humid coastal night. I started the engine of my sedan and navigated down the long gravel driveway. I did not check my rearview mirror. The drive back to Atlanta passed in total silence. The dark stretch of highway offered a stark contrast to the suffocating confines of the Savannah estate. My mind was clear, focused on the precise legal mechanics scheduled to execute on Monday morning. They had drawn their line in the sand, unaware that the tide had already washed the beach away. The weekend concluded without a single phone call from the coast. My parents likely believed their ambush had shaken me, assuming my silence was a symptom of guilt rather than strategy. When Monday morning arrived, the sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, illuminating the glass tower of my corporate office. I sat at my desk, watching the digital clock on my secondary monitor. The 10-day eviction ultimatum expired at exactly 9 o'clock. The moment the digits shifted, the automated legal protocols initiated. There were no extensions. There were no grace periods. The Chatham County Courthouse clerk processed the final foreclosure decree. The primary debt was extinguished, traded for the underlying collateral. The title to the historic estate formally transferred from the delinquent borrowers to the senior lien holder. Peach State Holdings, LLC, was now the sole uncontested owner of record. An hour later, my corporate attorney David walked into my office suite. He did not wear his usual relaxed demeanor. He carried a sleek black folder, handling it with the reverence one might reserve for a delicate, highly valuable artifact. The county recorded the transfer. David confirmed, his voice reflecting the gravity of the transaction. "The deed is secured. There are no secondary liens, no pending disputes. The property belongs to your holding company." He slid the black folder across my glass desk. I opened the cover. Resting inside was the original, newly issued master deed. The thick, textured paper carried the raised seal of the county registrar. I traced my fingers over the embossed emblem. The tactile sensation of the document grounded the abstract numbers I had stared at for weeks into a physical, undeniable reality. The heavy weight of the paper represented millions of dollars, countless hours of ruthless corporate negotiation, and the total dismantling of the Frank family legacy. My name, listed as the sole proprietor of the holding company, sat printed in bold black ink. I thanked David and asked for a few hours of privacy. The final piece of the trap required precise drafting. I opened a new file on my computer and selected a standard emotionally detached residential lease agreement template. This was the same generic form used for transient renters across the state, a document devoid of any sentimentality or aristocratic prestige. I began filling in the sterile blanks. Landlord, Peach State Holdings, LLC. Tenants, Richard and Caroline Frank. I navigated to a real estate valuation database to calculate the fair market rent for a historic multi-acre coastal property. The algorithm generated a towering monthly figure, a number that accurately reflected the white columns, the wraparound porch, and the sprawling, manicured lawns. I typed that exact premium into the payment clause. I did not offer a family discount or a subsidized rate. I demanded the precise mathematical value of the space they were currently occupying. I continued scrolling through the dense legalese checking boxes with cold, deliberate justice. I mandated a strict security deposit, knowing their bank accounts were drained. I included a standard 30-day eviction clause for any missed payments, establishing a rapid timeline for their removal. I even checked the box prohibiting unauthorized structural modifications, a quiet, ironic nod to the imported Italian glass sunroom Caroline was attempting to build on my property without my permission. I printed the contract. The office printer hummed, spitting out the crisp, white pages. I aligned the edges, stapled the corner, and placed the lease agreement directly underneath the master deed inside the black folder. The paperwork was ready for Caroline's upcoming Historical Society tea party. While I sat in my quiet Atlanta office orchestrating their eviction, the final pillar of my father's social standing was crumbling 200 miles away. I would learn the devastating details later that afternoon from Maya, whose logistics network kept her closely tied to the coastal gossip mill. Richard Frank had decided to attend a prestigious networking luncheon at his exclusive country club. He likely went there seeking new marks, hoping to convince a wealthy peer to float him a private loan after my refusal at the dining table. He sat in the mahogany-paneled dining room, smoking a cigar, projecting the image of a seasoned titan of industry. The air smelled of aged leather and expensive tobacco. He ordered top-shelf scotch and a prime-cut steak, laughing loudly with a local alderman and a shipping magnate. He performed his role flawlessly, maintaining the illusion of a man who held the world in his palm. When the waiter presented the leather check presenter, Richard did not even glance at the total. He pulled his heavy black card from his tailored blazer and dropped it onto the silver tray with practiced nonchalance. The waiter walked away, weaving through the crowded tables of the Savannah elite. He returned 3 minutes later, but he did not hand the receipt over with a polite, deferential smile. He leaned down, his face pale, and whispered something discreetly into my father's ear. Richard flushed a deep, dark shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He snatched the card back and handed the waiter a different premium credit card, his voice rising in sudden irritation as he blamed a magnetic strip malfunction. The waiter returned a second time, shaking his head. The shipping magnate sitting across the table paused, his silver fork hovering in the air. The hushed conversations at the neighboring tables sputtered into an uncomfortable, strained silence. The dining room was an echo chamber, and everyone was suddenly paying very close attention to the patriarch of the Frank family. "Try it again," Richard barked, the panic finally cracking his polished veneer. He tossed a third card onto the table. "The machine is broken. Run the numbers manually." The waiter stood his ground, apologizing nervously, but the volume of his response carried across the quiet room. The acoustics of the country club amplified every word. "The terminal is functioning perfectly, Mr. Frank," the waiter said, his voice echoing over the pristine white tablecloths. "Every single one of your accounts is reporting as frozen by the issuing banks due to severe delinquency." "I am sorry, sir, but the cards are declining." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dozens of wealthy peers, the very people Richard had spent his entire life trying to impress, stared at him. The illusion was dead. The untouchable coastal aristocrat could not even afford to buy his own lunch. The drive back to the coast felt entirely different this time. I did not carry the weight of a daughter seeking approval, nor did I harbor the anxiety of an impending ambush. I drove with the detached precision of an executive executing a hostile takeover. Resting on the passenger seat of my sedan was the slim black leather folder containing the master deed and the newly drafted residential lease. The Georgia sun beat down on the windshield, a glaring reminder of the scorching reality about to hit the Frank family. I navigated the familiar coastal curves, my mind rehearsing the exact sequence of events required to dismantle my mother's remaining dignity. Today was not an ordinary Thursday. It was the afternoon of the Savannah Historical Society Tea Party. For Caroline, this event served as the undisputed crown jewel of her social calendar. She had spent the last 2 decades treating her membership as a royal decree, using the gatherings to solidify her rank among the local elite. The women who attended these functions were the true architects of coastal high society. They dictated reputations over porcelain cups of Earl Grey and delicate cucumber sandwiches. To host this specific gathering was to declare yourself royalty. For Caroline to host it while her husband's credit cards were declining across town was a breathtaking display of delusional arrogance. I turned into the long driveway. The crushed gravel crunched beneath my tires, signaling my arrival. The perimeter of the lawn was lined with luxury vehicles. Chauffeurs polished windshields, while valets in crisp white shirts hurried to assist the late arrivals. A young attendant rushed toward my car, his hand extended to take my keys. I bypassed him entirely. I parked the sedan near the edge of the manicured grass, securing the vehicle myself. I grabbed the leather folder, tucked it neatly into my designer handbag, and walked toward the towering white columns. The front door stood wide open to catch the coastal breeze. I crossed the threshold, my heels striking the original pine floorboards. The grand foyer hummed with the melodic chatter of wealthy women. I walked toward the grand parlor, absorbing the sensory details of my mother's desperation. She had done a remarkable job masking the missing heirlooms. Where the antique sideboard used to sit, she had instructed a florist to arrange a sprawling cascade of imported orchids. The vibrant petals drew the eye away from the faded wallpaper. It was a clever optical illusion, a fragile web woven to hide the hollow shell of her finances. I stepped into the parlor. The room was packed with Savannah's most influential matriarchs, adorned in pastel silk dresses and wide-brimmed hats. The air smelled of expensive tea, warm sugar, and underlying panic. The moment I crossed the threshold, the dynamic of the room shifted. A few women near the entrance paused their conversations, their gazes locking onto me. They recognized the corporate daughter, the outcast who preferred a desk job in Atlanta over a suitable local marriage. The silence rippled outward, spreading like a stone dropped into a still pond. The clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups ceased. Caroline stood near the grand fireplace, holding a delicate teacup. She wore a tailored linen suit in a soft shade of lavender. When she saw me standing in the doorway, the color drained from her face. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the fragile china. She placed the cup onto a nearby tray with a sharp, involuntary clatter. Panic flared in her eyes, quickly followed by a dark, simmering rage. She had explicitly banished me from this house just a few nights ago. My presence here, uninvited and unannounced, threatened to shatter the fragile theater she was directing. She moved swiftly, weaving through her esteemed guests with a tight, artificial smile plastered across her face. She intercepted me before I could walk any further into the parlor. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my blazer. The grip was intended to steer me back into the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the Historical Society. Genevieve Caroline hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for my ears. "What are you doing here? I told you never to return. You are embarrassing me in front of the committee. Leave this instant before I call security to drag you off my property." I did not pull my arm away. I stood my ground, feeling the frantic, vibrating energy radiating from her hand. I looked down at her fingers, then up into her eyes. The desperation in her stare was profound.
She was a woman cornered by her own lies, trying to maintain an aristocratic posture while the floor fell away beneath her feet. "I am not here to embarrass you, Caroline," I said, keeping my voice level, though I projected the words clearly enough to carry over the quiet room. "I am here to conduct business." "Business?" she scoffed, her grip tightening. "You have no business here. This is a private gathering of the Historical Society. It is for people who respect heritage. You do not belong in this room. You are trespassing." The surrounding guests were now openly watching the exchange. Women leaned closer to their companions, their eyes wide with curiosity. The polite veneer of the tea party was fracturing. This was the exact audience my mother had weaponized for years to belittle my career. They had laughed at my modest salary. They had pitied my lack of social ambition. Now they were going to witness the mathematical conclusion of that mockery. I reached into my handbag. The smooth leather of the folder slid easily into my grasp. I pulled the black portfolio out, holding it between us. Caroline stared at the object, her brow furrowing in confusion. She expected an emotional outburst, a tearful apology, or a bitter argument. She did not expect documentation. "I am not trespassing," I stated, my tone stripping away any remaining warmth. "I cannot trespass on an asset I legally possess." I stepped around her, breaking her grip. I walked toward the center of the room, approaching the large silver tea tray resting on the polished oak coffee table. The matriarchs parted to let me through, their silence heavy and expectant. I reached the table and opened the black folder. I extracted the crisp, textured pages of the master deed and the accompanying residential lease agreement. The room held its collective breath. I laid the physical paperwork directly onto the silver tray, resting it among the delicate porcelain cups and the plates of untouched pastries. The stark black ink contrasted sharply with the ornate silver. I did not scream. I did not perform. I spoke with the icy precision of a senior director executing a corporate mandate. "The foreclosure period is over," I announced, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the grand parlor. The previous note was accelerated due to severe delinquency and fraudulent borrowing attempts. The debt is extinguished. The title to this estate has been legally transferred. Caroline rushed to the table, her lavender suit rustling in the quiet room. Her chest heaved as she stared down at the documents resting on her prized silver tray. The words seemed to blur before her eyes. She reached out with a trembling hand, lifting the first page of the master deed. "This is a forgery," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is a pathetic, vindictive stunt. You do not have the capital to buy this debt. This paper says the owner is Peach State Holdings." She scanned the dense legal text, searching for a loophole, searching for the clerical error she so desperately wanted to believe in. Her eyes darted across the paragraphs until they reached the bottom of the page. She stopped. The air seemed to leave her lungs. Her gaze locked onto the final authorization line. Right there, beneath the corporate seal of Peach State Holdings, rested my unmistakable signature, authorizing the acquisition as the sole owner and chief executive of the holding company. Caroline stood frozen. The lavender fabric of her suit trembled slightly as her breathing grew shallow. She stared at the signature at the bottom of the master deed. The bold black ink spelled out my name, confirming my status as the sole proprietor of Peach State Holdings. The reality of the document crashed into her curated world, fracturing the delicate illusion she had spent decades maintaining. The parlor descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The influential women of the Historical Society, the undisputed judges of coastal prestige, stopped talking. They lowered their porcelain teacups to their saucers, the quiet clinking sounds amplifying the tension in the room. They could not read the fine print from their respective positions, but they possessed a predator's instinct for weakness. They read the devastation contorting my mother's features. They recognized the unmistakable posture of a woman whose foundation had just collapsed. I did not offer her a moment to recover. I reached back into the slim leather folder and withdrew the second document,
I placed the crisp generic residential lease agreement directly next to the deed on the silver tray. The sterile contract sat in stark contrast to the opulent floral arrangements and the antique furniture. "You are no longer the lords of this manor," I stated, my voice even and devoid of any emotional inflection. Caroline slowly raised her eyes from the tray, meeting my gaze. Her expression was a chaotic mixture of profound shock and rising terror. "The previous National Bank is out of the picture," I continued, ensuring my words carried across the quiet room so every single guest could hear the truth. "Your debt was accelerated due to severe delinquency and fraudulent borrowing attempts. The foreclosure period is final. Peach State Holdings is the singular owner of record for this entire estate. You do not own this property. You are now my tenants." I reached forward and tapped the payment clause printed on the second page of the lease. "I calculated the fair market value for a historic property of this acreage," I explained, maintaining the clinical tone of a corporate director briefing a subordinate. "I did not include a family discount. Market rent is due in 30 days. If the funds do not clear my corporate account by the 1st of the month, I will begin formal eviction proceedings." I turned the page, pointing to the secondary clauses designed to box them into a corner. Section 4 mandates a standard security deposit payable immediately in cash or certified funds. Section 7 strictly prohibits any unauthorized structural modifications. That means your imported Italian glass sunroom project is officially canceled. You do not have permission to alter my property. The words acted as a physical blow. Caroline collapsed inward. The sheer weight of the public humiliation crushed her. She brought her hands up to cover her face, emitting a high, piercing sob that echoed off the high ceilings. The tears flowed freely, ruining her pristine makeup, staining her lavender lapels. She wept not for the loss of her home, but for the sudden, undeniable death of her social standing. The matriarchs exchanged wide, shocked glances. A few of the women stepped backward, physically distancing themselves from the spectacle of insolvency, treating my mother's financial ruin like a contagious disease. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Richard pushed his way through the crowd of silk dresses, his face flushed with heat and the lingering effects of daytime drinking. He had likely been hiding in his study, nursing his bruised ego after his credit cards declined at the country club luncheon earlier that afternoon. He assessed the scene, taking in the weeping woman, the silent audience of elites, and his estranged daughter standing over the coffee table. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard bellowed. He attempted to project the booming, unquestionable authority he no longer possessed. He marched toward the center of the parlor, positioning himself between me and the silver tray. He looked down at the paperwork, his brow furrowing in confusion, then glared at me. "Are you causing a scene in my home?" "It is not your home," I corrected him, gesturing toward the legal documents. "Your name is no longer on the title." Richard snatched the deed from the tray. His eyes scanned the legal phrasing, skipping over the boilerplate text to find the core declarations. The blood drained from his face, turning his complexion a sickly shade of gray, only to return seconds later with a darker, more dangerous shade of red. His jaw clamped tight. The reality of the situation collided with his towering, fragile pride. Instead of accepting the mathematical facts, he chose to escalate the theater. He tossed the deed back onto the table, dismissing the legal weight of the embossed county seal. "This is a ridiculous stunt," Richard barked, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You forged these papers to humiliate us in front of our guests. I will not tolerate this insolence under my roof. Leave this property immediately." I remained perfectly still, offering no reaction to his posturing. "I am conducting an administrative visit to deliver a lease to my new tenants," I replied. Richard turned toward the foyer, his voice echoing off the crown molding. "I am calling the local authorities," he declared, pulling his cell phone from his tailored blazer pocket. "I know the police chief personally. I play golf with him every Sunday. I will have you arrested and dragged off this estate in handcuffs. You are trespassing." I watched him unlock his screen and dial the numbers. I felt a profound sense of pity for his delusion. He truly believed his social connections could override federal banking laws and county property registries. I gestured toward the paperwork resting on the tray. "You cannot trespass on your own property, Richard," I said. The words hung in the air, cold and irrefutable. The legal truth paralyzed him. His thumb hovered over the call button, trembling slightly. The police chief could not save him from a valid deed. The authorities would only arrive to enforce my rights as the sole property owner, further cementing his public ruin in front of Savannah's most influential women. The guests murmured among themselves, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The high society matrons were already calculating how fast they could leave the estate and spread the gossip across the coastal city. Before Richard could formulate a response or put his phone away, a sudden commotion erupted in the hallway. Another voice cut through the mounting tension. Preston shoved his way into the grand parlor, nearly knocking over a tall floral arrangement. His designer suit was unbuttoned, his silk tie hanging loose around his neck. He smelled of stale alcohol and sheer panic. He looked ragged, a man pushed to the brink by the impending divorce and his towering mountain of unfunded liabilities. He had likely just returned from a failed meeting with his phantom investors, only to find the estate swarming with confused socialites. He saw the sterile lease agreement resting on the table. He saw Caroline weeping hysterically into her hands. He saw the empire he intended to inherit reduced to a stack of generic rental forms. The panic hijacked his rational thought. The reality of his impending poverty snapped the last remaining threads of his composure. Out of sheer desperation and denial, Preston lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure, untethered rage, screaming that this was fraud and he was going to sue me for every penny I had. Preston halted just inches from the silver tea tray. The collective gasp of the Historical Society matriarchs broke his momentum. The influential women were already edging toward the grand foyer, their pastel silk dresses rustling in a frantic exodus to escape the scandal. Richard grabbed his son by the shoulder, pulling him back, terrified of adding a physical assault charge to their mounting public disgrace. Preston smoothed his ruined silk tie, his chest heaving, and spat a final breathless threat before storming out of the parlor. I simply gathered my black folder, leaving the physical lease resting among the porcelain teacups, and walked out the front door. 3 days later, a process server approached my Atlanta office building. Preston had managed to scrape together enough loose cash to retain legal counsel. He did not hire a prestigious downtown firm. He found a strip mall attorney desperate enough to file a baseless emergency injunction against Peach State Holdings. The petition alleged predatory lending practices, corporate espionage, and familial coercion. It was a chaotic, poorly drafted document, littered with spelling errors and emotional appeals, rather than citing actual legal precedent. Preston grew up believing he could manipulate any system the same way he manipulated country club waitstaff, assuming his surname carried enough weight to bend reality. The Chatham County Municipal Courthouse offered a stark contrast to the opulent coastal mansions my family preferred. There were no imported orchids or crystal chandeliers. The environment was sterile, defined by scuffed linoleum floors, harsh fluorescent lighting, and the scent of industrial floor cleaner. I sat at the polished defense table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. My corporate attorney, David, sat beside me, organizing a meticulously indexed binder of evidence. Across the aisle, Preston and his bargain counsel huddled together. My brother looked exhausted, his leg bouncing with nervous energy under the wooden table. Richard and Caroline sat in the spectator gallery behind him, their faces drawn, refusing to make eye contact with me. They looked shrunken, stripped of the aristocratic posture they normally wore like armor. The presiding judge was a veteran jurist with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He adjusted his reading glasses and instructed the plaintiff to present their case. Preston's lawyer stood up, shuffling a disorganized stack of loose papers. He launched into a meandering narrative about legacy unfair corporate maneuvering and alleged emotional distress. He tried to paint my holding company as a shadow entity designed solely to steal ancestral land, gesturing wildly toward his client to emphasize the supposed tragedy of the situation. He spoke for 8 minutes before the judge interrupted, demanding empirical evidence of fraud. The lawyer stammered, offering only hearsay and Preston's inflated sense of entitlement. David stood up next. He did not raise his voice or attempt to appeal to the judge's emotions. He simply walked the court through the chronological paper trail. He submitted the original debt instruments, the records of prolonged delinquency, the certified acceleration notices, and the undeniable proof of Richard's fraudulent bridge loan attempt. Finally, David presented the pristine wire transfer confirmation, proving my company paid the holding bank in full, executing a flawless, legally binding acquisition. The proceedings lasted exactly 19 minutes. The judge slammed his folder shut, glaring down at the plaintiff table. He dismissed the injunction with prejudice, stripping Preston of any future ability to contest the deed. The magistrate did not stop there. He delivered a stern, blistering reprimand, warning the Frank family that any further attempts to weaponize the judicial system to avoid their financial obligations would result in severe sanctions for frivolous litigation. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. The transfer of power was legally immortalized. I exited the double doors of the courtroom, walking into the wide, echoing corridor. Maya stood near the elevator banks. She wore a striking crimson trench coat, her posture straight, projecting an aura of untouchable independence. She held a thick manila envelope in her hands. Preston emerged from the courtroom a moment later. His shoulders slumped, his bargain lawyer already rushing toward the exit to escape the humiliation of the swift defeat. When Preston saw his wife waiting by the elevators, a brief, pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across his face. He walked toward her, likely intending to ask for a temporary loan to cover his fresh legal fees. Maya raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. She stepped forward and pressed the manila envelope flat against his chest. "These are the finalized decrees," Maya stated, her voice echoing down the sterile hallway. "The judge signed off on the separation of assets this morning. I am no longer tied to your sinking ship." Preston stared at the paperwork, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You cannot do this," he whispered, clutching the envelope with trembling fingers. Maya offered a cold, razor-thin smile. "I spent the last 3 years building an enterprise from the ground up," she told him, her words slicing through his lingering arrogance. "I negotiated contracts, managed fleets, and created tangible worth. You spent 3 years ordering custom luxury vehicles with money you did not earn, drinking expensive bourbon you could not afford, and pretending you were a king. You squandered your inheritance on an illusion. I am taking my reality and walking away." She turned on her heel. As she walked past me, she paused for a fraction of a second. Our eyes met. There was no need for conversation. We shared a quiet, profound nod of mutual respect. We were 2 women who had navigated the toxic labyrinth of the Frank family and emerged victorious, holding the keys to our own empires. The elevator doors chimed opening to swallow her crimson silhouette, leaving Preston standing alone in the corridor, holding the undeniable proof of his isolation. I returned to Atlanta to wait out the remainder of the month. The 30-day lease agreement I had left on the silver tea tray was a ticking clock. During those 4 weeks, the silence from the coastal estate was absolute. My corporate servers registered 0 attempts to initiate communication or negotiate the terms. I monitored the local real estate databases, noting that Caroline had not attempted to list any more antiques for sale. The private liquidator must have refused to do business with them after the county clerk publicized the foreclosure. They were trapped, living inside a house that no longer belonged to them, staring at a calendar counting down their final days of shelter. On the first day of the new month, the deadline arrived. I sat at my glass desk accessing the Peach State Holdings banking portal. To my genuine surprise, the mailroom notified me that an overnight envelope had arrived from Savannah. Inside rested a personal check signed by Richard Frank, made out for the exact towering amount of the monthly rent I had mandated. I endorsed the slip and fed it through the secure digital scanner on my desk. The machine hummed, pulling the paper through the optical reader. I watched the progress bar load on my monitor, waiting for the Federal Reserve System to clear the funds. The screen flickered. A bright red rejection notice flashed across the display. The check bounced in spectacular fashion, returned for insufficient funds. The bright red rejection notice flashed across the display. The check bounced in spectacular fashion, returned for insufficient funds. There is a distinct difference between being broke and being insolvent. Broke is a temporary condition, a brief disruption in cash flow. Insolvency is a permanent, structural state of failure. My parents had reached the terminal stage. The bounced check was their final pathetic attempt to stall the inevitable. They sent a worthless piece of paper, hoping I would grant them an administrative extension while the banking system processed the failed transaction. They assumed I operated with the same lenient, polite discretion they demanded from their country club bartenders. I did not grant extensions. I did not send a warning email or attempt to call them to discuss the failure. I forwarded the digital rejection slip directly to my legal team. David filed the formal writ of possession with the Chatham County Clerk before noon. In the state of Georgia, once a lease is violated and the grace period expires, the property owner does not have to engage in further negotiations. The court issues a mandate, and the county sheriff executes the physical removal. The process is designed to be swift, impartial, and entirely detached from the emotional pleas of the debtors. 2 days later, I drove south to the coast for the final time as a visitor. The autumn air carried a sharp chill, stripping the heavy humidity from the Savannah sky. I pulled my sedan onto the familiar oak-lined street, but I did not drive all the way to the estate. I parked near the corner intersection, waiting for my scheduled escort. A marked county sheriff cruiser pulled up behind me a few minutes later. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out of the vehicle. They were seasoned officers, familiar with the grim procedural reality of foreclosures. We exchanged brief introductions on the sidewalk. They reviewed the court-ordered writ, verifying the magistrate's signatures and the target address. I got back into my car and led the brief procession down the street. The arrival of law enforcement in this particular neighborhood was a seismic event. This was an enclave designed to project perfection, a community where reputations were carefully curated over generations. As the cruiser rolled slowly down the pavement, the illusion of privacy evaporated. I saw the curtains twitch in the tall windows of the adjacent mansions. Next door, an elderly socialite who had attended my mother's disastrous tea party stopped watering her manicured hydrangeas. The brass hose nozzle dropped onto the grass as she stood on her walkway, staring openly at the marked vehicle. The neighbors were stepping out onto their expansive porches. They were gathering to watch the Frank family face the ultimate social execution. We parked in the circular driveway. The crunch of the tires seemed unusually loud in the quiet morning air. I stepped out of my sedan, holding the black leather folder containing the writ. The lead deputy walked up the wide front steps. He did not ring the polished brass doorbell. He knocked on the heavy wooden door with a heavy, authoritative rhythm. The sound echoed through the quiet coastal air, signaling the definitive end of an era. Several minutes passed. The deputy raised his hand to knock again, but the heavy deadbolt clicked. The door swung open. Richard stood in the threshold. The transformation was startling. The booming titan of industry was gone, replaced by a hollow, aging man. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, the collar frayed and unbuttoned. He had not shaved in days. His eyes darted past the deputies, landing on the neighbors watching from the edge of the property line. The remaining color drained from his face as he realized his ruin was no longer a secret rumor. It was a public spectacle. "Mr. Frank, the deputy," stated, his tone firm and professional. "We are here to execute a court-ordered writ of possession on behalf of Peach State Holdings. You and all other occupants must vacate the premises immediately." Richard did not argue. The fight had been drained out of him. He looked at me standing at the bottom of the brick steps. He opened his mouth, perhaps to hurl one final insult or offer a desperate, impossible plea, but the words died in his throat. He simply turned and walked back into the grand foyer, leaving the door open for us to follow. I crossed the threshold alongside the officers. The interior of the house felt entirely different. The ambient temperature was cold, the central heating turned off to save whatever pennies they had left. I walked past the parlor and moved toward the long hallway leading to the bedrooms. That is when I saw Caroline. My mother was not wearing her tailored linen suits or her custom emerald gowns. She wore a faded silk robe, pulling it tight around her waist, as if trying to hold herself together. She was wandering the corridor with slow, aimless steps. Her hair was unkempt, her posture stooped. She looked like a ghost haunting a space she no longer recognized. I watched from a distance as she reached out, running her fingertips along the intricate woodwork of the door frames. She had spent her entire adult life curating this museum of vanity. Every piece of furniture, every framed painting, every velvet drape was selected to project dominance. When she traced the carved details of the crown molding, she was touching the boundaries of her lost kingdom. She stopped in front of a blank space on the wall where a heavy gilded mirror used to hang before they pawned it to the private liquidator. She pressed her palm against the bare floral wallpaper. A low, ragged sob escaped her lips. It was the sound of a woman realizing the true cost of her lifelong obsession. She had sacrificed her relationships, alienated her daughter, and bankrupted her husband, all to maintain the appearance of aristocratic superiority. Now, the antique silver was gone. The designer clothes meant nothing. The high society peers she worshipped were currently standing on their porches, whispering about her disgrace. Her unrelenting snobbery had cost her the only tangible thing she actually valued. The deputies instructed Richard to gather their immediate personal belongings. A moving truck pulled into the driveway behind the cruiser. I had contracted a private relocation crew to clear out the remaining furniture and box up the personal items, charging the labor cost against their unreturned security deposit. The workers flooded into the house, carrying heavy cardboard boxes and rolls of industrial packing tape. The house erupted into a symphony of consequences. The noise was startling in a home that had spent decades wrapped in hushed, polite conversations. The loud, ripping sound of packing tape echoed off the high ceilings. The heavy thud of work boots vibrated through the original heart pine floorboards. Movers dismantled the heavy mahogany bed frames, wrapping them in thick, protective blankets. They cleared the kitchen cabinets, tossing expensive china into padded boxes with zero reverence for the brand names. Every sound reinforced the finality of their removal. Caroline did not help pack. She sat on a small wooden stool in the kitchen, staring blankly at the marble countertops. Richard dragged 2 battered suitcases into the grand foyer. He did not look at his wife. The fracture between them was vast, widened by the mutual realization that their shared delusions had destroyed their future. The lead deputy handed Richard a clipboard, requiring a signature to confirm the peaceful surrender of the property. My father signed the document with a trembling hand. He handed the clipboard back, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy brass keyring. The keys clinked together, a sharp metallic chime. "Give them to the owner," the deputy instructed, gesturing toward me. Richard walked over to where I stood. He did not meet my gaze. He held out his hand and dropped the keys into my palm. The metal was heavy and cold. He turned around, walking into the kitchen to retrieve his wife. He guided Caroline out of the house. They walked down the front steps, passing the uniformed deputies and the moving crew. They walked toward a rented sedan parked at the end of the driveway, their luxury vehicles having been repossessed days earlier. The neighbors watched the fallen monarch's retreat, cementing the Frank family exile from Savannah high society. The moving crew worked for another 3 hours, emptying the closets, hauling away the rugs, and stripping the estate down to its bare architectural bones. The workers eventually loaded the last box into the truck, pulling the heavy metal door shut. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle rolled down the gravel path, following the deputies back toward the main highway. The silence returned, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of denial. It was the pure, unburdened quiet of a cleared ledger. I stood in the center of the empty grand foyer. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the bare floorboards. There was no antique furniture to cast shadows. There were no imported floral arrangements to mask the scent of old wood and coastal salt. The space was immense, hollow, and entirely mine. The keys rested in my palm. I was standing in the ruins of their empire, entirely alone. Standing in the empty foyer, the silence was profound. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight. The echoes of Caroline and her high heels were gone, replaced by the hollow sound of my own breathing. I walked through the parlor, the formal dining room, and the expansive kitchen. The house was enormous, a sprawling monument to coastal aristocracy, but it felt remarkably small now that the illusion was stripped away. I knew instantly I could never live here. The walls held too many toxic memories. Every room contained a ghost of my childhood, a lingering whisper of criticism about my clothing, my career, my choices. To sleep in the master bedroom would be to accept the lingering poison of the Frank family. I did not buy this property to become the new lord of the manor. I bought it to dismantle the throne. The following Monday, I contracted a premier commercial architectural firm out of Atlanta. I did not hire a historical preservation society. I handed the lead contractor the master deed and a set of uncompromising blueprints. The directive was clear: gut the interior, erase the antebellum shrine, transform the residential estate into a state-of-the-art corporate retreat for Peach State Holdings. The demolition phase began 2 weeks later. I stood on the edge of the lawn, wearing a hard hat, watching the crew tear through the superficial layers of my parents and their vanity. The imported floral wallpaper was scraped away, revealing bare, unvarnished drywall. The ornate chandeliers were lowered and hauled off to a scrap liquidator. The restrictive, suffocating parlor walls were knocked down, creating an expansive, open-concept floor plan designed for executive strategy meetings and corporate training seminars. The sound of sledgehammers echoed across the pristine neighborhood, a rhythmic, undeniable drumbeat announcing the permanent end of the Frank legacy. The neighbors watched from their porches, clutching their pearls, as the architectural symbol of Savannah elite society was systematically re-engineered into a sterile, functional asset. The new design featured sleek glass partitions, ergonomic conference tables, and high-speed fiber optic servers installed where the antique mahogany sideboard used to rest. The gardens were redesigned, replacing the high-maintenance orchids with sustainable, minimalist landscaping. It was an exercise in pure function over form, a total rejection of the superficial prestige that had bankrupted my father. The transformation took 6 months. During that half year, the social landscape of the coastal city shifted. The vacuum left by my family was quickly filled by new money and younger entrepreneurs. Savannah high society is a ruthless ecosystem. It does not mourn the fallen. It simply steps over them. The reality of their exile was harsh. Richard and Caroline did not find a miraculous savior. Their friends at the country club abandoned them the moment the credit cards declined. They relocated to a small 2-bedroom rented condominium on the far western outskirts of the county, miles away from the historic district and the waterfront views they felt entitled to. The condo was situated near a busy commercial highway, surrounded by strip malls and fast food chains. They were stripped of their domestic staff. their luxury vehicles, and their curated identities. Caroline no longer attended the Historical Society tea parties. Her former peers uninvited her, erasing her name from the registry with the same cold detachment she once used to dismiss my career. She spent her days sitting on a tiny concrete balcony, listening to the roar of highway traffic, isolated and forgotten. Richard attempted to secure a position as a consultant for a local shipping firm, but his reputation as a fraudulent borrower preceded him. The executives he patronized in the past refused to return his calls. He was reduced to a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the periphery of the business community he used to rule. Preston fared no better. Following the swift finalization of his divorce, he was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The phantom tech startup collapsed before it even secured a tax identification number. He rented a cheap apartment over a noisy dive bar downtown, working a commission-based sales job he despised, forever severed from Maya and her thriving logistics wealth. Spring arrived, bringing a fresh, warm breeze off the ocean. The corporate retreat was officially finished. The property was unrecognizable, stripped of its toxic history, and reborn as an engine of commerce. I stood on the newly renovated wraparound porch. The original rotting wood had been replaced with durable composite decking. The ornate rocking chairs were swapped for sleek, modern outdoor seating. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A black town car pulled up to the entrance. Maya stepped out of the vehicle. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and designer sunglasses, radiating the calm, assured energy of a woman who owned her destiny. She walked up the front steps carrying 2 tall cups of iced sweet tea from a local cafe we both favored. We had not seen each other since the brief encounter outside the municipal courtroom, but the bond forged in the fires of the Frank family collapse required no daily maintenance. She handed me a cup. The condensation dripped down the plastic, cool against my palm. She took a seat on one of the modern outdoor sofas, looking out over the manicured minimalist lawn. "It looks entirely different," Maya noted, her voice smooth and appreciative. "You removed the rot." I took a sip of the sweet tea, letting the cold liquid settle my nerves. "It functions now," I replied. "It generates value instead of draining it." We sat on the porch for hours as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the coastal grass. We did not discuss Richard Caroline or Preston. Their names belonged to a closed chapter, a redundant file archived deep in the past. We did not waste our breath dissecting their failures or mourning the familial bond we never truly possessed. We focused our energy on the horizon. Maya outlined her plans to expand her logistics fleet across the state line, securing lucrative commercial shipping routes. I shared my firm and its blueprint for acquiring a new portfolio of distressed commercial assets in the neighboring county. We spoke the language of ledgers, contracts, and calculated risks. The air around us felt light, unburdened by the suffocating weight of false aristocratic prestige. The neighborhood remained quiet, the surrounding mansions standing as silent witnesses to the new order. The old guard had fallen, replaced by women who understood the precise surgical power of leverage. I leaned back against the cushions, listening to the faint sound of the coastal wind moving through the oak trees. The journey was grueling, fraught with unyielding arrogance and desperate manipulations, but the outcome was irrefutable. You do not need to raise your voice to win a war. You do not need to scream, throw insults, or perform for a captive audience. You simply secure the leverage, wait for the inevitable collapse, and let the paperwork speak for itself. We live in an era where the architecture of the modern family is frequently built on a foundation of optics rather than ethics. Across the American landscape, particularly within enclaves of deep historic prestige, we see sprawling estates, curated social media feeds, and generational wealth passed down like a sacred baton. Yet beneath this polite veneer of country club memberships and holiday galas, there is often a profound spiritual hollow. The story of Genevieve and the Frank family is not merely a tale of financial maneuvering. It is a resonant modern parable about the soul of traditional family education. From the perspective of a spiritual practitioner, one who views life as a continuous journey of self-cultivation, this narrative exposes the perilous chasm between appearing successful and actually possessing the wisdom, morality, and resilience required to navigate human existence. To the parents raising children in today's highly competitive society, the Frank family serves as a devastating mirror. In traditional culture, there is a dangerous temptation to confuse social standing with moral virtue. Richard and Caroline believed their worth was permanently anchored in the heart pine floors of their Savannah mansion. They viewed their children not as independent souls requiring emotional awareness and nurturing, but as extensions of their own fragile egos. When parenting is driven by the desperate need to maintain appearances, honesty becomes the first casualty. They lied to their peers, they lied to their children, and ultimately, they lied to themselves, hiding their insolvency behind imported Italian glass and pawned silver. This environment teaches children a deeply toxic lesson that love is conditional, tethered strictly to how well they perform the family script. A brother like Preston is the natural byproduct of this spiritual rot. Raised to believe his surname was a substitute for character, he developed an artificial confidence entirely dependent on external validation. He lacked the inner fortitude to face his own shortcomings, resulting in a frantic, hollow existence. Parents must understand that true family responsibility is not about shielding children from the friction of reality or buying them luxury vehicles they have not earned. True responsibility is equipping them with the ethical framework to stand firm when the social facades eventually crumble. If you build a child's identity on the shifting sands of public opinion, you guarantee their eventual collapse. For the younger generation, Geneviève's silent, methodical rise offers a masterclass in profound resilience. Young adults today are bombarded with the pressure to broadcast their success loudly, to argue their worth in the court of public opinion. Yet true strength is constructed in the shadows. Geneviève's journey highlights the necessity of building a systematic architecture of personal growth. She did not scream for validation when her family mocked her quiet corporate career. She did not waste her energy trying to reform people who were committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she turned inward. She cultivated her own intellect, discipline, and emotional fortitude. This is the very essence of self-cultivation. It requires stripping away the noise of external judgment to forge a core of unshakable competence. By focusing on undeniable mathematics and legal truth, Geneviève transcended the emotional chaos of her bloodline. For young people navigating toxic environments, the message is clear. Your worth is not defined by those who refuse to see it. You must become the architect of your own stability, developing the wisdom to recognize illusion, the ethics to operate cleanly, and the resilience to let your undeniable results speak on your behalf. Viewed through a spiritual lens, the collapse of the Frank estate is a necessary correction of cosmic balance. To cultivate oneself is to seek harmony with the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth may be. Richard and Caroline operated in a state of terminal delusion, constantly manipulating their environment to serve their vanity. They lacked the triad of a meaningful life, wisdom, morality, and resilience. Wisdom is the ability to see things exactly as they are, without the distortion of pride. Morality is the courage to live honestly, even when it costs you your social standing. Resilience is the strength to rebuild from the ashes of your own mistakes. Because the parents possessed none of these, their empire was always destined to fall. This brings us to a truth that pushes against the grain of conventional American family values. Society relentlessly preaches a doctrine of unconditional forgiveness within the family structure. We are told that blood is thicker than water, that we must absorb the blows, keep the peace, and if necessary, co-sign the predatory loan to save the ancestral home. We are conditioned to believe that maintaining the family unit at all costs is the highest moral virtue. But true spiritual clarity demands something far more difficult. Sometimes the highest act of love, or the purest expression of moral justice, is to step aside and allow the collapse to happen. Shielding toxic, unrepentant family members from the consequences of their own actions is not loyalty. It is enabling their spiritual decay. By legally foreclosing on her parents, Geneviève did not commit an act of cruelty. She delivered a profound, necessary reckoning. She dismantled the false idol they had worshipped their entire lives, forcing them to finally step out of the illusion and stand on the bare earth of reality. True loyalty to the self often requires the willingness to let the dysfunctional structures of the past burn down. Only when the false foundation is removed can genuine growth ever take root. We are all building a legacy, whether we realize it or not. The question is whether we are building it on the solid bedrock of quiet truth or the fragile scaffolding of other people's opinions. If you found resonance in the quiet steel of Genevieve's journey, I encourage you to subscribe to Morning Revenge, where we explore the deep, often unspoken realities of family justice and the power of walking away. As you look at the architecture of your own life, ask yourself, if the social prestige, the titles, and the ancestral inheritances were stripped away tomorrow, what would remain? Are you holding the keys to your own reality, or are you merely a tenant in an illusion someone else built? The answer to that question is the only inheritance that truly matters.